I'm not sitting next to him. The words sliced through the low hum of first-class conversation so sharply that several passengers turned their heads before they even realized they were listening. Flight attendants paused. A businessman lowered his newspaper. Somewhere near the galley, the metallic click of a service cart seemed unusually loud. Victoria Kensington stood beside seat 2A, one manicured hand gripping the leather headrest as she stared at the man already seated beside the window. Her expression was not angry. It was worse. It was certain that everyone around her would agree, certain that the world would rearrange itself to suit her discomfort. The man she was staring at looked up slowly from the tablet resting on his lap. Marcus Johnson wore a charcoal gray jacket that had seen better days and a plain blue shirt with no visible designer logo. A worn leather laptop bag rested beneath his seat. Nothing about him attracted attention. Nothing except the calmness in his eyes. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" the flight attendant asked carefully. Victoria glanced at Marcus before lowering her voice just enough to make it obvious she wanted everyone to hear. "I'd prefer another seat." The attendant offered a polite smile. "Unfortunately, first class is completely booked today." Victoria's jaw tightened. "Then perhaps someone can explain why I'm expected to sit here." The silence that followed felt heavier than the luggage stored overhead. Marcus remained still. Outside the window, rain streaked across the glass in thin silver lines as airport lights reflected against the wet tarmac. The aircraft was preparing for departure from Charlotte, North Carolina, bound for New York City. Most passengers were focused on their phones, their meetings, their schedules. But now every eye seemed drawn toward row 2. Victoria shifted her designer handbag onto her shoulder and shook her head. "This is unbelievable." Marcus looked at her for a brief moment. Not angry, not offended. Simply observing. The kind of look that suggested he had seen this before. Many times before. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "if another seat becomes available, you're welcome to take it." His voice was calm and measured, carrying none of the tension now filling the cabin. Somehow that only made Victoria more uncomfortable. She looked away first. The flight attendant attempted to ease the situation with professional patience, but the damage had already been done. Passengers exchanged glances. A teenager several rows back subtly lifted his phone. Another traveler pretended to read while clearly listening. Marcus returned his attention to the tablet screen as if the conversation were already over. Yet something about his composure seemed to unsettle Victoria more than any argument could have. She finally dropped into her seat with visible reluctance and crossed her arms. The engines outside began their low mechanical roar as boarding completed. Above them, soft amber cabin lights reflected against polished surfaces and expensive watches. Victoria stared straight ahead, determined not to acknowledge the man sitting less than 2 feet away. What she didn't know was that within the next 24 hours, millions of people would know exactly who she was. And what she didn't know was that the quiet man beside the window was carrying a secret far more powerful than money, status, or influence. As the aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate, a small camera lens continued recording from 3 rows away, capturing every second of a moment that was about to change both of their lives forever. The aircraft leveled above a blanket of clouds glowing silver beneath the afternoon sun. Most of the passengers had settled into the familiar rhythm of a 2-hour flight. Laptop screens opened. Coffee cups steamed gently on tray tables. Quiet conversations blended with the constant hum of the engines. Marcus Johnson sat by the window, his attention focused on a spreadsheet displayed on his tablet. The numbers moved across the screen in neat columns, but every few minutes his eyes drifted beyond the glass. 35,000 feet below, the world looked peaceful. Cities, highways, and neighborhoods disappeared beneath layers of white cloud, reducing everything to shapes and shadows. He always liked that view. Up here, nobody looked richer. Nobody looked more important. Everybody was simply another passenger traveling from one place to another. The thought brought a faint smile to his face. Across the aisle, Victoria Kensington noticed the smile and immediately looked away. She had spent most of the flight pretending Marcus did not exist. Occasionally, she glanced at her phone, scrolling through messages from employees and business partners. Kensington Capital was preparing for the biggest announcement in company history. By tomorrow afternoon, she expected to finalize a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The transaction would place her firm among the most influential investment companies in the country. At least, that was the plan. She checked another message and smiled confidently. Her assistant had confirmed that reporters would attend the signing ceremony in Manhattan. Everything was falling into place exactly as she had imagined. Meanwhile, Marcus opened a different document. This one contained photographs rather than financial projections. The images showed students standing beside new computers in classrooms scattered across small towns in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Some of the buildings looked worn and outdated, but the smiles on the students' faces were impossible to miss. Marcus studied each photograph carefully. Years ago, he had promised himself that if he ever succeeded, he would create opportunities for children who grew up with fewer resources than others. The foundation he quietly funded now supported thousands of students across the country. Very few people knew about it. He preferred it that way. Recognition had never interested him as much as results. A flight attendant approached his seat carrying a cup of black coffee. "Compliments of the captain, Mr. Johnson," she said softly. Marcus looked surprised. "That is very kind. Thank you." Victoria's eyes immediately lifted from her phone. The attendant smiled warmly before continuing down the aisle. Marcus took a careful sip and returned to his work. The exchange lasted only seconds, yet Victoria could not stop thinking about it. Something about the interaction felt unusual. The captain did not typically send complimentary drinks to random passengers. She glanced toward Marcus again. His jacket looked ordinary. His laptop bag showed signs of age. Nothing about him suggested wealth or influence. Yet the crew seemed to know exactly who he was. The thought lingered in the back of her mind as the plane continued north. A few rows behind them, the teenager who had quietly recorded the boarding incident earlier tapped his screen. The short video had already been uploaded before takeoff. At first, only a handful of people viewed it. Then dozens. Then hundreds. By the time the aircraft began its descent toward New York, the number continued climbing faster than anyone on board could possibly imagine. Neither Victoria nor Marcus had any idea that the story had already begun traveling far beyond the cabin walls. The aircraft touched down at John F. Kennedy International Airport just after 5 o'clock in the evening. Rain clouds hung low above the city, turning the sky into a sheet of muted gray. As passengers gathered their belongings and stepped into the aisle, the tension that had briefly surrounded row 2 seemed to disappear into the routine rush of travel. People checked messages. Business travelers hurried toward connections. Families searched for carry-on bags. Life moved forward. Marcus waited patiently until the crowd thinned before standing. He slid his tablet into the worn leather bag and adjusted the strap over his shoulder. His movements were unhurried, almost deliberate. The flight attendant who had served him coffee earlier smiled as he passed. "Safe travels, Mr. Johnson." Marcus returned the smile. "Thank you. Have a wonderful evening." A few feet away, Victoria noticed the exchange again. The same quiet respect. The same familiarity. For reasons she could not explain, it irritated her. She stepped into the jet bridge without looking back. Outside the terminal, a black luxury SUV was already waiting. A driver in a dark coat opened the rear door immediately. "Good evening, Miss Kensington." Victoria climbed inside and began reviewing tomorrow's presentation before the vehicle even pulled away from the curb. Her schedule was packed. Television interviews, investor meetings, a press conference. By this time tomorrow, she expected headlines across every major business publication in America. The city lights reflected across the SUV windows as Manhattan slowly emerged from the rainy evening. Meanwhile, Marcus entered a much smaller vehicle waiting near another terminal exit. No luxury branding, no security detail, just a simple black sedan. The driver, an older man named Samuel, greeted him with a warm smile. "How was the flight?" Marcus settled into the passenger seat. "Long enough." Samuel laughed. "That means something happened." Marcus glanced out the rain-speckled window. Nothing worth discussing. The sedan merged into traffic. Horns echoed through the wet streets as thousands of commuters fought their way through rush hour. Marcus opened his phone and found dozens of unread messages. Most involved tomorrow's meetings. Others came from directors within the Johnson Foundation. One message included photographs from a new educational center opening in rural Alabama. Marcus paused on that one longer than the others. A small group of children stood beneath a freshly painted sign, smiling proudly despite the drizzle falling around them. He saved the image before locking his phone. Across the city, however, another image was spreading far faster. The video from the airplane had escaped the boundaries of social media's usual noise. What began as a brief recording viewed by a few hundred people had grown into tens of thousands of views, then hundreds of thousands. Users shared it with captions expressing disbelief. Others debated it. News bloggers reposted clips. Comments multiplied by the minute. The algorithm had found exactly the kind of content that captured attention. Yet Victoria remained completely unaware. Inside her penthouse overlooking Central Park, she stood before floor-to-ceiling windows reviewing financial projections while city lights shimmered below like scattered diamonds. Her assistant called with updates on tomorrow's event. Investors were arriving. Reporters had confirmed attendance. Everything appeared perfect. Victoria ended the call feeling satisfied. She poured herself a glass of sparkling water and smiled at her reflection in the dark glass. 24 hours from now, she believed she would be celebrating the greatest achievement of her career. At nearly the same moment, Marcus entered his hotel suite downtown. The room was elegant but understated. A soft lamp illuminated stacks of documents waiting on the desk. He loosened his tie and sat beside the window overlooking the Hudson River. Boats moved slowly across the black water beneath distant lights. His phone vibrated once, then again, then several times in rapid succession. Marcus frowned slightly and opened the notifications. The first message contained a link. The second contained the same link. So did the third. Curious, he tapped the video. Within seconds, he saw the airplane cabin. He saw Victoria standing beside her seat. He heard her voice. Then the clip ended. Marcus stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone face down on the table. Outside, rain continued tapping softly against the glass. Inside, the room remained silent. He made no calls, posted no statements, sent no complaints. But somewhere beyond those windows, the story was accelerating faster than either passenger could possibly control. By 6 o'clock the next morning, New York was waking beneath a blanket of low clouds and steady rain. Yellow taxis splashed through puddles. Steam drifted from street grates. Office towers glowed with thousands of lights as another business day began. Inside her penthouse, Victoria Kensington stood before a mirror adjusting the sleeve of an expensive navy blazer. Every detail had been planned, every appearance carefully managed. Her phone buzzed continuously on the marble countertop, but she ignored it while reviewing talking points for the afternoon announcement. The deal scheduled for noon represented years of work, negotiations, and ambition. Investors from across the country were expecting good news. Reporters were preparing articles before the contracts had even been signed. For Victoria, the future looked brighter than ever. Finally, she reached for her phone. The moment the screen lit up, her confidence faltered. More than 200 missed notifications covered the display. Messages from colleagues. Messages from clients. Messages from people she had not spoken to in years. Her assistant's name appeared repeatedly. Victoria frowned and opened the first text. "Call me immediately." The second message was even shorter. "This is serious." The third contained a link. Curious, she tapped it. Within seconds, the familiar image of an airplane cabin appeared. She watched herself standing beside the seat, heard her own voice, saw the uncomfortable silence that followed. The clip ended after less than 30 seconds. Victoria blinked. Then she checked the view count. Her stomach tightened. Millions. The number continued rising as she watched. Thousands of new reactions appeared every minute. News accounts had reposted it. Business bloggers were discussing it. Public figures were commenting. The story had escaped social media and entered the mainstream conversation. Her phone rang before she could process the shock. It was her assistant. Victoria answered immediately. "Tell me this is being exaggerated." Silence lingered for a moment. "I wish I could." Victoria walked toward the window overlooking Central Park. Rain streaked down the glass. "How bad is it?" 3 investors postponed meetings this morning. Victoria felt her grip tighten around the phone. Postponed. And 2 corporate partners released statements distancing themselves from the company. The city suddenly felt quieter, colder, larger. Victoria listened as her assistant continued listing developments. Negative articles, interview requests, public criticism, internal concerns from board members. Each update landed heavier than the last. Across town, Marcus sat alone in a hotel conference room reviewing documents beneath soft overhead lighting. Financial reports covered the polished oak table. Through the windows, the Hudson River moved slowly beneath the gray morning sky. Samuel entered carrying coffee. Looks like the internet had a busy night. Marcus accepted the cup. Apparently. You planning to say anything? Samuel asked. Marcus glanced toward the rain outside. No, Samuel studied him carefully. Most people would. Marcus remained silent for a moment. Most people are free to make their own choices. He opened another report and continued reading. Meanwhile, Victoria's situation worsened by the hour. News channels began replaying the video. Commentators debated it. Analysts questioned whether her leadership reflected the values expected from modern corporations. By 10 o'clock, one major investor had officially withdrawn support from a pending agreement. At 11, another followed. Standing inside a glass-walled conference room high above Manhattan, Victoria watched executives whisper among themselves while television screens displayed headlines she never imagined seeing. Less than 24 hours earlier, she believed she was approaching the greatest victory of her career. Now, as storm clouds darkened the skyline outside, it felt as though something far larger than a public relations problem had begun unfolding around her. At 11:35, the conference room on the 42nd floor felt colder than the weather outside. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a skyline hidden behind rain and fog, while a long glass table reflected the anxious faces gathered around it. Victoria sat at the head of the room, her posture straight, her expression controlled, but the confidence she had worn that morning was beginning to crack. Every few minutes another phone vibrated. Another email arrived. Another update appeared. None of them were good. Across from her, members of the board exchanged uneasy glances. One investor quietly closed a folder and folded his hands. Another stared at the financial projections projected onto the wall as if they belonged to a different company. The energy in the room had changed completely. Less than 24 hours earlier, everyone had expected a celebration. Now they looked like passengers sensing turbulence ahead. We can still stabilize this, Victoria said, breaking the silence. Her voice remained steady, though it required effort. The fundamentals of the company have not changed. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, one board member cleared his throat. The fundamentals are not the concern. Victoria already knew what was coming. Then what is? The man hesitated. Trust. The single word seemed to hang in the air. Outside, rain streaked down the windows in long silver lines. Another executive opened a tablet and turned the screen toward her. The video was playing again. Millions of views had become tens of millions. National news outlets were covering the story. Corporate watchdog groups had issued statements. Industry leaders were distancing themselves from the controversy. The issue was no longer the 30 seconds recorded on an airplane. It had become a symbol people were discussing everywhere. Victoria felt frustration rising inside her chest. This is ridiculous, she said. One interaction should not define an entire career. Nobody argued. Yet nobody agreed either. Then her assistant entered the room, carrying a tablet. Her face was pale. I am sorry to interrupt. Victoria immediately recognized the look. Something else had happened. What now? She asked. The assistant swallowed. The Horizon Investment Group has requested an emergency review before signing. Silence swept across the room. Horizon was the cornerstone of the entire deal. Without them, everything unraveled. Victoria stood so quickly her chair rolled backward several inches. A review? Yes. For what reason? The assistant glanced down at the screen. They have concerns regarding leadership culture and long-term reputation risk. The room became perfectly still. Victoria felt as though the floor beneath her had shifted. Horizon had spent months conducting evaluations, months reviewing documents, months negotiating terms. They were not supposed to be reconsidering anything. Who made this decision? She asked. The assistant looked uncertain. The chairman requested it personally. Victoria's heartbeat quickened. Who is the chairman? The assistant hesitated again before answering. Marcus Johnson. For the first time all day, Victoria forgot about the headlines, the investors, and the video. The name landed with unexpected force. Images from the airplane flashed through her mind. The quiet man by the window, the worn leather bag, the calm voice. The passenger she had dismissed in seconds. Around the table, confusion spread as several executives searched the name online. One by one, Expressions changed. Eyes widened. Brows lifted. Someone whispered a number under his breath. Another stared at a biography displayed on a screen. Technology entrepreneur. Philanthropist. Founder. Chairman. Billion-dollar investment leader. Victoria remained motionless. Outside, thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the clouds. Inside, the realization arrived slowly and all at once. The man she had considered insignificant was now standing between her company and the future she thought was guaranteed. The rain had not stopped. By early afternoon, Manhattan seemed wrapped in a curtain of gray, the skyscrapers fading into mist above the streets. Victoria sat alone in a private conference room overlooking the city. For the first time in years, she had nowhere she wanted to be and no phone call she wanted to answer. Her reflection stared back from the darkened window. Tired eyes. Tight shoulders. A woman who had spent her life believing control could solve every problem. Yet control was slipping away one piece at a time. On the polished table beside her sat 3 unopened bottles of water, several abandoned reports, and a tablet displaying headlines she no longer wished to read. Every article seemed to tell the same story. Every discussion seemed to circle back to the same 30 seconds. Victoria slowly closed the screen. Silence returned. Across town, Marcus sat in a quieter room. The executive suite reserved for Horizon Investment Group overlooked the Hudson River. Rain tapped softly against the glass. A tugboat moved through the dark water below, its horn echoing faintly through the afternoon. Marcus stood near the window holding a cup of coffee that had long since cooled. Behind him, stacks of reports remained untouched. Samuel entered carrying a folder. "The review committee is ready whenever you are." Marcus nodded. "Thank you." Samuel hesitated. "You know everyone thinks this meeting is about the airplane." Marcus looked out at the river. "Everyone is wrong." Samuel studied him for a moment before leaving. The door closed quietly. Once again, the room fell silent. Marcus opened the folder. Inside were months of findings gathered by analysts and auditors. Financial discrepancies, compliance concerns, internal culture reports, employee complaints. None of it had anything to do with an airplane. None of it had appeared overnight. The concerns had existed long before the flight from Charlotte, long before the video, long before either passenger knew the other existed. Marcus turned another page, then another. His expression never changed. Outside, rain continued tracing slow paths across the glass. Back in Midtown, Victoria finally received the call she had been expecting. "They want you at Horizon headquarters in 1 hour," her assistant said. Victoria swallowed. "Are they canceling the deal?" A pause followed. "I do not know." The uncertainty felt heavier than any answer. After the call ended, Victoria remained seated for several minutes. The city below moved normally. People crossed intersections carrying umbrellas. Traffic lights changed colors. Life continued. Yet everything felt different. She found herself remembering small details from the flight. The calm voice. The patience. The absence of anger. Marcus had never argued with her. Never embarrassed her. Never attempted to prove anything. Somehow that realization hurt more than criticism ever could. 45 minutes later, a black sedan carried her through wet streets toward Horizon's headquarters. Water sprayed beneath the tires as the city blurred past the windows. Victoria stared outside without really seeing anything. The future she had imagined 24 hours earlier was gone. In its place stood uncertainty. And somewhere above the rain-soaked skyline, hidden behind steel, glass, and clouds, the truth she had refused to see was waiting for her at the end of the road. The elevator doors opened onto the top floor of Horizon Investment Group at precisely 2 o'clock. Victoria stepped into a reception area lined with dark wood, soft lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-covered Hudson River. The atmosphere felt different from every corporate office she had visited before. There were no oversized displays celebrating wealth. No walls covered in self-congratulatory awards. Everything felt purposeful, restrained, and quiet. "Hey." Receptionist greeted her politely and directed her toward a conference room at the end of a long hallway. Each step seemed louder than the last. By the time she reached the double doors, her pulse was impossible to ignore. Inside, a dozen people were already seated around a polished table. Attorneys, analysts, executives, review committee members. Folders and reports sat neatly arranged before them. No one appeared angry. No one appeared emotional. that somehow made the room feel even more intimidating. Then Victoria saw Marcus. He sat near the center of the table, wearing the same calm expression she remembered from the flight. There was no trace of triumph on his face. No satisfaction. No desire to embarrass her. He simply looked prepared. The room fell silent as she entered. Marcus stood and offered a professional nod. "Miss Kensington, thank you for coming." Victoria sat down slowly. Rain tapped against the glass behind them. The city beyond the windows appeared blurred beneath layers of gray cloud. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Marcus opened a folder. "Before we begin, I want to address something." Victoria braced herself. "The incident on the airplane has nothing to do with today's review." She stared at him, unsure she had heard correctly. Marcus continued. "The review process started months ago, long before either of us met." Several committee members nodded. One analyst slid a report across the table. Marcus opened it. "Our team identified concerns involving internal reporting procedures, compliance documentation, employee retention patterns, and governance oversight." Another document followed. Then another. Page after page revealed issues that had accumulated over time. Not scandals, not crimes, but warning signs. Decisions delayed. Problems ignored. Feedback dismissed. Small cracks that had gradually widened beneath the surface. Victoria listened in stunned silence. Every concern was supported by months of evidence. Every conclusion had been independently verified. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody attacked her personally. The facts spoke for themselves. The realization settled heavily across the room. The airplane video had not destroyed the deal. It had simply arrived at the worst possible moment. Marcus closed the final report and folded his hands. "The public controversy accelerated attention," he said quietly. "But these findings existed before that." Victoria looked down at the documents spread across the table. For the first time in 24 hours, something inside her shifted. She had spent the entire day believing one event had caused everything to collapse. Now she understood the truth was more complicated. The video had exposed a perception problem. The reports had exposed a leadership problem. Together, they painted a picture she could no longer ignore. Marcus studied her carefully before speaking again. People often think success protects them from consequences. His voice remained calm. In reality, success usually magnifies them. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Outside, a shaft of sunlight briefly broke through the clouds, casting pale light across the conference table. Marcus glanced toward the window and then back at Victoria. "This decision was never about who sat beside whom on a plane," he said. "It was about whether Horizon could trust the future leadership of a company managing hundreds of millions of dollars." The room remained perfectly still. And in that moment, Victoria finally understood that the quiet man she had dismissed in seconds had never been the obstacle standing in her way. The obstacle had been every warning she refused to see before it was too late. The meeting ended without raised voices, dramatic exits, or final arguments. In many ways, that made the outcome feel even heavier. One by one, executives gathered their documents and quietly left the conference room. Rain still tapped against the windows, though the storm had begun to weaken. The gray sky over Manhattan was slowly brightening. Victoria remained seated long after everyone else had departed. The reports were still spread across the table before her. Pages filled with decisions she had defended, warnings she had ignored, concerns she had dismissed because success had made it easy to believe she was always right. Across the room, Marcus closed his folder and prepared to leave. He had no interest in prolonging the moment. The review was complete. The decision had been made. Yet as he reached the door, he heard Victoria's voice. "Mr. Johnson." He stopped and turned. For a moment, neither spoke. The city stretched beyond the glass behind them, silent and distant. Finally, Victoria stood. Gone was the confidence that had filled the airplane cabin. Gone was the certainty that money and status could solve every problem. She looked tired, honest, human. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. Marcus listened without interrupting. Victoria took a slow breath. Not because of the headlines. Not because of the investors. Not because of this deal. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the rain-covered skyline. "I judged you before I knew anything about you." The words seemed difficult for her to say, perhaps because they were true. Marcus remained calm. "Thank you for saying that." Victoria nodded slightly. The strange thing is that I spent years telling myself I was fair, professional, objective. A faint, bitter smile appeared and disappeared. It turns out people can lie to themselves without realizing it. The room fell quiet again. Marcus walked back toward the table. Not as a chairman, not as an investor, simply as another person. We all have blind spots, he said. The difference is whether we are willing to see them once they are revealed. Victoria looked at him carefully. You could have used that video against me. Marcus shook his head. I did not need to. He glanced toward the reports. The truth was already sitting in this room. The answer landed gently, but carried weight. For the first time since the crisis began, Victoria understood something important. Marcus had never been trying to defeat her. He had never been seeking revenge. The review had followed the evidence. The consequences had followed the choices. Nothing more, nothing less. Outside, sunlight finally pushed through the thinning clouds, casting golden reflections across the Hudson River. The change was subtle but impossible to miss. Victoria noticed it too. What happens now? She asked. Marcus looked toward the light spreading across the water. That depends on what you learn. From today, she lowered her eyes briefly before nodding. There was no instant solution waiting for her. No miracle rescue. No sudden restoration of everything she had lost. Only the difficult work of rebuilding trust and becoming someone better than she had been yesterday. As Marcus walked toward the door, Victoria spoke once more. Thank you. He paused. For what? A small smile touched her face. For treating me with more respect than I showed you. Marcus nodded once and left the room. The door closed softly behind him. Victoria remained standing beside the window, watching sunlight break through the storm, realizing that accountability felt painful, but honesty felt strangely freeing. 6 months later, spring sunlight washed across the glass roof of LaGuardia Airport as travelers moved through the terminal carrying coffee cups, rolling suitcases, and plans for destinations scattered across the country. The storm that had once dominated headlines had long since faded from public conversation. New stories had replaced old ones. New controversies had captured attention. The world had continued moving forward, as it always did. Victoria Kensington walked through the terminal carrying a simple leather briefcase and wearing none of the outward confidence that had once defined her. Her company still existed, but it looked very different now. Several executives had been replaced. New policies had been implemented. Employee feedback programs had been expanded. The rebuilding process had been difficult, expensive, and humbling. Yet for the first time in years, Victoria felt as though she was leading with honesty instead of image. As she approached her departure gate, she noticed a familiar figure seated near the windows overlooking the runway. Marcus Johnson sat quietly reading from a tablet, while afternoon sunlight reflected across the polished floor around him. For a moment, Victoria simply stood there. The memory of that flight months earlier returned with surprising clarity. The crowded cabin, the assumptions, the consequences, the lessons she had never expected to learn. Marcus eventually looked up and noticed her. A faint smile appeared. Good afternoon, Ms. Kensington. Victoria smiled back. Good afternoon, Mr. Johnson. There was no tension between them now. No awkwardness. Just two people sharing a brief moment in a busy airport. Marcus gestured toward the empty seat beside him. Looks like we are both traveling again. Victoria glanced at the chair and laughed softly. Looks like it. Then, without hesitation, she sat down. The same simple action that had once seemed impossible now felt completely natural. Outside the massive windows, airplanes taxied beneath clear blue skies. Sunlight shimmered across their wings. Travelers hurried past without recognizing either of them. The world did not pause for dramatic endings. It rarely did. For several minutes they talked about ordinary things. Community projects, education programs, business challenges, future plans. Nothing extraordinary. Yet somehow the conversation felt meaningful precisely because it was ordinary. Eventually boarding announcements echoed through the terminal. Passengers began gathering near the gate. Marcus stood and picked up his worn leather bag. The same bag Victoria remembered from that first flight. Some things, she realized, had never changed. Marcus extended his hand. Take care of yourself. Victoria shook it warmly. You too. Then they walked towards separate boarding lines. Different destinations. Different futures. As Marcus disappeared into the crowd, Victoria paused near the window one final time. The afternoon sun cast long golden reflections across the runway. Aircraft lifted into the sky one after another, climbing toward distant horizons. She watched quietly, feeling neither regret nor resentment. Only gratitude. Gratitude for a lesson that had arrived disguised as a setback. Gratitude for the opportunity to become someone better than she had been before. Far across the terminal, Marcus continued toward his gate, his footsteps steady and unhurried. Outside, a jet rose above the city and disappeared into brilliant light. And in the quiet space left behind, there was no victory to celebrate, no enemy defeated, and no score settled. There was only the simple, enduring truth that dignity does not come from wealth, status, or appearance. It comes from the way people choose to see one another when they finally learn to look beyond themselves.